비상계엄 사태로 시작된 정치 불안이 한국 경제의 대외 신인도를 갉아먹는 것 아니냐는 우려가 큰 요즘입니다. 안 그래도 내수, 수출 등 경제 펀더멘털이 약해지던 상황에서 정치 불안까지 겹치자 한국 경제를 바라보는 해외 투자자들의 시선도 흔들리고 있습니다. 치솟은 환율과 국내 증시에서 유독 강한 외국인 매도세가 그 결과일 텐데요. 진짜 해외 투자자들은 지금 한국을 어떻게 바라보고 있을까요? Ts롬바르드의 로리 그린 아시아 리서치 헤드 겸 수석 이코노미스트를 만나봤습니다. 그린은 비상계엄 사태가 벌어졌던 12월 3일 당일에 월가를 포함한 글로벌 리서치 회사 가운데 가장 먼저 리포트를 내고 윤 대통령의 탄핵과 그 후 시나리오 전망을 내놔 주목을 받은 한국 전문가입니다. First, I would like to ask how was this incident received by the foreign investors around you, of course, including yourself?
I mean, like for people in Korea, this was a real shock for everyone who watches Korea, who invests in Korea, and for us and our clients. This was happening in London afternoon time, New York morning, so very much within trading hours. People scrambling to try and readjust their positions, to come to terms, and to try and understand what was a very confusing situation. It was not clear at all what the objectives were, who was in charge. I had a lot of questions as to whether North Korea was involved. It was a very challenging situation for people outside of Korea to try to understand and to position for. Now that things have begun to calm down a little bit, people are still quite cautious, quite wary. In recent years, the foreigner perception of Korea has, not just from an investment standpoint, but I think culturally has been increasingly positive. K-pop, Korean drama, films, kimchi, etc., etc. is getting really, really, very popular all around the world. And now that perception has taken a little bit of a knock. Foreign investors used to be asking, why is Korea classified as an emerging market? Such a developed economy, very advanced technology, stable institutions, all these high-end cultural products. Whereas now with the political turmoil, it pushes the perceptions of Korea back towards that emerging market category given the political turmoil. So still a lot of uncertainty for foreign investors around the political outlook.
There was many developments over the weekend. Korea's parliament voted to impeach President Yoon. So what is your take on this progress of the situation? What scenarios do you foresee going forward?
The impeachment vote was passed quite quickly, and I think looking to the previous impeachment of Park Geun-hye, things appear to be happening faster. And I think there are a couple of reasons for this speed. Public opinion seems to be more strongly against President Yoon than it was against former President Park Geun-hye. I saw some of the signs that there's a huge protest in Daegu on Saturday, which was very strong traditional support base for the PPP. Opinion polls suggest 80 to 90% in favor of impeachment. So that's very, very strong. Two other factors here, I think, are, as well as the severity of what President Yoon did or attempted to do, particularly with some of the revelations around drones possibly flying into North Korea. This is concerning not just for South Korea, but also for South Korea's allies, such as the US. So I think there's some pressure coming from that angle. And then finally, we have this big majority in the National Assembly from the DPP and its allies. So I think these are different to the Park Geun-hye situation, suggest progress. So now we move to the Constitutional Court. I think again here could be a little bit faster than the Park Geun-hye case. There is obviously the issue with the number of judges, 6 where there should be 9. However, I think this time round, the composition of the Constitutional Court is more in favor of a fast result. Previously, the judges were appointed by Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye. This time round, most of them are from Moon Jae-in, with the National Assembly appointing another couple of judges, which I think will also be in favor of the impeachment. So I would expect, rough guess, would be around 2 months for this process to run through, which would be at a faster pace than the Park Geun-hye incident.
What I was very curious about was that the impeachment vote took place over the weekend, and yesterday, Monday, was the first trading day after the developments. Many thought that the heightened predictability of the political developments in Korea could maybe give more recovery to the Korean stocks and currency won, but it didn't really. Why do you think is the reason for this?
It's a really good point. I think there are two main drivers for this. Perhaps the first one is that from a foreign investor perspective, there was perhaps less clarity or understanding of the full impeachment process, and some people expecting that the National Assembly was enough to get the impeachment. The other side is, as well, more broadly, global macroeconomic conditions, Korea's specific position there, and the Trump risk, particularly for the Korean won. If we take the Trump risk, both for equities and the won, tariffs are clearly coming against China. That tends to hit the RMB in a big way, and we think depreciation for the Chinese currency is inevitable, and the spillovers there to Korean won are quite clear. It tends to move quite closely with the RMB. And then from a Korea-specific perspective, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, has been hugely beneficial for Korean exporters to the US. And the US has actually surpassed China as the major export destination for Korean products. Now, Trump is against the IRA. It was a Biden policy. It's all clean energy. That's against what a lot of his backers are in favor of. So this uncertainty around the Inflation Reduction Act, Trump might scrap it, and the potential damage that would do to what is Korea's largest export market now is a risk both for Korean FX and the won. And then a couple of other factors the markets are looking at. The BOK rate cuts are clearly biased towards a weaker won. National pension outflows, which tend to be stronger in the first half of the year, also push for a weaker won. And then from an equity standpoint, foreign investors, they focus on Samsung and SK Hynix. Samsung appears to be missing or lagging on the AI transition, on the AI adoption front, or in terms of its competitiveness on the memory chips needed to foster AI training and development. So this is hurting the KOSP and foreign inflows there. So a mix really of the politics being underestimated and also global macro and a lot of the risks potentially of what a Trump presidency might mean for Korean FX and equities.
There are so many fundamental risks the Korean economy is facing, even if we don't count this political risk. What I was concerned about was that, as you said, there are many Trump risks coming on Korea's way. Of course, the IRA and of course, the tariffs and so on. But in Korea, right now, we have very much going inside our country that it's so hard to make a united front to this incoming threat. Is this one of the maybe foreign investors are also thinking about?
I think that's certainly a factor. A lack of clear leadership of who is responsible for foreign policy, who is going to pick up the phone if Trump calls and wants Korea to pay more for US soldiers that are based in the country. That's very much a geopolitical concern. And then with clear macroeconomic spillovers, both in terms of the budgets getting passed, that is increasingly difficult, and also who would be negotiating on a trade front with the US. So fortunately, I don't think Korea is going to be a real direct target of President Trump, but there are all these the potential risks. It's very hard to predict what Trump might do in office, and having a lack of clear leadership in Seoul is definitely a negative factor for sure.
About the scenarios going forward in Korea, you have previously suggested that the early presidential election, if it happens, it may result to the DPP's win, and that might give a boost for the Korean economy. Does your previous scenario still sticks? And what is your GDP forecast for Korean economy from now on?
Our base case now is that GDP in 2025 will grow by 1.8% for Korea. And we have an upside scenario which depends on how quickly an election can take place and subsequently an emergency budget passed. President Yoon has had a broadly contractionary fiscal stance, and the DPP historically relatively expansionary, especially when they have control of the National Assembly. So if we could have elections before the end of April, with a budget passed quite quickly after that, then we think the fiscal impulse would fall into the second half of the year, and that could see Korean growth lift maybe to 1.9 or even 2% next year, compared to 1.8 without this election and new budget. And that upside could be even stronger if the election takes place before the end of April. But anything later, and then it pushes the fiscal spending into 2026, and there won't be a clear benefit for the economy next year.
About your strong fiscal theory, wouldn't the increased fiscal spending raise concerns and maybe risk about the fiscal deficits, which is basically going all around the world right now? Every countries are having doubts about their huge fiscal deficits. And why do you think that doesn't apply to Korea?
It would depend on how the fiscal spending is structured. In the case of a one-off kind of emergency budget, where it is not sort of a continuous increase in spending, just a one-off funding package, I think the concern around fiscal sustainability would be limited. However, were the DPP to come in and make longer term changes to a welfare policy, to government spending plans, this is something the market might take more notice of. And in Korea's case, I think there is perhaps one kind of interesting tail risk. Korean government bond yields have fallen rapidly in the last couple of months, partly reflecting slower growth outlook, Bank of Korea rate cuts, but also the inclusion in some global bond indexes, which is pushing yields down. Now, normally, however, Korean yields, particularly at the long end for the 10-year, they tend to trade quite closely in line with US treasuries. And that has started to diverge a little bit. Where next year, say in a downside scenario, you have a bigger budget, which markets start to worry about. And you also have Trump in the US being inflationary, the Fed higher for longer, and maybe higher US yields. Well, in that scenario, a tail risk scenario, we could have a surprise rise in government borrowing costs for Korea, and particularly the 10-year yield coming up as markets reprice on fiscal sustainability, and the US yield pulls up the cost of borrowing in Korea as well. And I think that is certainly a risk that is worth watching, but not a base case at this time.
As you mentioned, there is a very heightened tariff risks under incoming Trump administration. If the DPP government takes place in Korea, they will maybe, taking cues from the past, they may make more closer ties to China, which you already mentioned in your previous report. Wouldn't that be maybe a risk or additional conflict for Korea?
That's right. Typically, the DPP has leaned somewhat closer to China, is generally in favor of sunshine policy with North Korea, which is not viewed particularly favorably in Washington. And certainly the China trade relationship would not be viewed favorably by President Trump. So this would be something that, if a DPP candidate was elected president, that they would need to manage quite carefully, need to move very cautiously in this regard. Scope for greater trade relations, political relations with China, but of course remembering that the US is now Korea's largest trade partner and key for the country's national security. So it would be a very delicate balancing act. I think something that, say, if Lee Jae-myung was elected, I think he would lean in towards a relationship with Beijing, but it would have to be one that is very carefully calibrated. So it's very important in sort of wider efforts for the US to balance China's rise within Asia. And then economically and technologically, Korea, despite some problems at Samsung, is world leading within semiconductors and an array of advanced manufacturing technologies that the US is seeking to catch up on and cut China dependency on. From a China side, Korea is still an important supplier of very high value tech inputs into the supply chain and is a key regional player. So it's someone that Beijing would like to be close to. So this is a strong position, one that I think Korea could play quite well, try to balance between the two sides, win some benefits from US, some positive concessions from China, perhaps on trade. That is something that I think could certainly be played cautiously, but I think is an avenue for Korea to continue to try and pursue a bit of balance between the two superpowers over the next 5-10 years.
Very fresh perspective that we are in a very good position. I always thought that we are in a very tricky, very unfortunate position geopolitically.
Maybe it helps if you're not sitting in, you can view from an outside perspective.
You said that if the DPP president comes in and make a friendlier relations with China, that can be another drive for a potential boost for Korean economy.
That's right. Both from a trade perspective, an investment side, and tourism as well. So there's a lot of scope for greater cooperation with Korea and China. I think still the levels have not recovered to what they were before the THAAD, way back, many years ago now, and still the tourism has not recovered back to those levels. So I think there is certainly scope for cooperation and positive benefits, with of course Korea needing to be wary of China's move up the manufacturing value chain.